Hi there, welcome to the Miria Valhalla Art Studio where inspiring minds meet. My name is Miria and I've just finished this little painting, and I had a lot of fun doing it because I had set myself some very specific goals, and one of them was to not overwork the painting. And so this took about an hour and a half, and I took a couple little breaks in between just to make sure that I didn't go on my stubborn side and continue when I might not want to. A few other goals were to work with warm and cool color and juxtaposition of bright and dull. The other thing I really want to make sure of is to allow for broken color, letting little bits of color show through the other colors that I was laying on top as I went along. It was a really fun process to try and create the brightness and luminosity in this painting, and I hope you enjoy this video. If you enjoy it, please like it and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Take care. I decided to start this painting on a white ground so that I could allow the light to bounce off of the canvas and through the subsequent layer of glazed paint. I'm using a 2H pencil to do the drawing on this. It's a little bit of a harder pencil and there's less smudging when I paint on the glaze. I'm darkening the pencil lines just to make sure that I'll be able to see through the paint once I apply it. I'm putting down a layer of GAC 500 with a 1/3 glazing medium. This glazing medium slows down the drying time of the paint. I plan to paint wet on wet, so here I'm putting on hansa yellow medium with a wide brush, applying it lightly and thinly. I don't want to get too thick with this paint. My goal is to wipe off the areas that are going to be light, where the light is hitting. This is a really fun process. You start to see the design right away just with the layer of yellow and removing the paint. I used a wet paintbrush, and the paint wasn't coming off well enough, so I went to a paper towel and I'm pressing really hard with my hand, and then went back to the brush for the narrower marks, using a little bit more water. I'm looking at my reference on the left, looking for any marks that might be quite light. It can be a little bit confusing when you first start doing something like this design, because there are a lot of vertical lines, and making sure that you're hitting the light parts of the trees and not in between the trees where the shadows will go later on. Here I'm taking transparent red oxide and quite a bit of medium and using the flat edge of a palette knife to apply the paint. I'm trying to meet my goal of creating broken color, so I'm allowing the paint to go on very unevenly. And I like the way it looks. It's very bark-like and simple to do. When working with your palette knife on a project like this one, hold the knife fairly flat to the canvas, and when you want to make those narrower marks, turn your knife onto a side and scrape the paint on your palette, creating a ridge, and then when you lay that down onto your canvas, you'll make a nice thin line. As you go along adding more paint, turn your palette knife in different directions, and you can press harder and softer and put little scrape marks here and there. Your goal is to create texture and a bit of brokenness to this, so it's not a solid layer of paint. Here I'm continuing to add and deduct paint. It's still transparent red oxide, and what I want to do now is to join up some of the shadow shapes that are running between these trees. This helps to create lost edges in the painting. Here I finished adding the transparent red oxide. I've put scratch marks into places between the trees just to create a sense of organic material. And here in the foreground, I've taken a tint of yellow oxide and adding it on top of that bright yellow. I'm also doing scratch marks within that wet paint, and in Italian it's called sgraffito, which just means to scratch in. I've also tinted some transparent red oxide and added that into that foreground color as well. So there's a little bit of combo of that more orangey color that looks almost pink when you add white along with that yellow oxide. It can be a real pleasurable process to do negative space painting, and that is to paint between things rather than starting in your background and working forward. And this allows you to play a little bit more with your layers of broken color. So continue along and look for places to tint. Be aware that your acrylics will dry darker, so make sure you go light enough as the other parts of your paintings dry. So one of my goals here is to keep everything in the quite the light family and not to get too dark. I'm back with that red iron oxide I found a few more places where I could add some joined shadows and creating a little bit more depth and darkness in the foreground. One of my other goals was to paint overall light to dark and continue that way. I'm continuing to add bits of light and slightly darker lights and adding a little bit thicker paint, allowing me to show even more scratch marks with that palette knife. This is going a little bit cooler looking than I wanted it to be. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the yellow into that light paint and going a little bit thicker on top. So I'm touching very lightly. This paint underneath is still a little bit wet. So there's a little bit more yellow in the foreground. It's the same hansa yellow. And now I'm going back to the background, finding more places where I could add the transparent red oxide to show the dark areas. Here I've taken some white paint with the tiniest little titch of that transparent oxide. You might not be able to see that on the video, but it is there. I avoid using pure white in a painting, and this is to create more color interest. So now we have the vertical line showing us where the dark side of the trees are, as well as the lit side. So here I've mixed a bright yellow green, adding a bit of phthalo blue into that hansa yellow light plus white, and going with my plan of overall light to dark. This is my next shade, and just finding the places where this green will live. You know, looking up at my reference every once in a while, and plus ignoring the reference if I need to, and just making sure the colors are balancing. Looking at the foreground grasses, I could see that there are some really lovely cool greens. So I took the same green from above and added white, which immediately will cool a color, and added it between some of those bright yellow marks in the grass. So moving on to my next shade, I've picked up some Pyrrole Red Light, which is a nice warm red color. It's also opaque, and I'm adding it in between the trees where I can see the leaves that have turned color for the fall. And while I'm adding that, there's the white bits you see, it's actually medium, and I've added quite a bit of that too, so it allows me to take that really opaque paint and scratch into it and spread it a little more easily. To make the color look a little more interesting, I've added some cad orange, which is a little bit lighter than that Pyrrole Red Light. And then seeing that I need some lit areas in the foliage, I added some cadmium yellow medium as well. So basically the yellow to the orange to the red is a gradation of color moving around the outside of the color wheel. Now that I had some of those medium red colors down, I realized that the foreground was a little bit too dark, so I just tinted that again. And before I play around in that, I took some dioxazine violet and laid it over top of that transparent red oxide in the vertical shadows of the trees. My goal here is to make sure that I'm using broken color and letting that transparent red oxide show through in places between the purple colors. Here I finished putting down the violet color, and violet is one of the darker colors on your outside of your color wheel, and so it darkens very nicely. Here I've taken phthalo blue plus a little bit of that Pyrrole Red Light to dull it and white, and created a mid-tone for the sky in the background. Being careful not to go too light so it doesn't create a distraction from the highlights of the trees. I decided to add some duller greens into the painting, and I did this by taking the yellow green and adding a little bit of the transparent red oxide. and that gave it a nice dull natural green color. This duller green is enhancing the brightness of the other colors, just in its contrast. As I go along, I look for places to go a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, and also in the tree bark that I'm working on right now, I've added a slightly darker shade of white with the transparent red oxide. And when that was dry, I went back and added a few more shadows of the transparent red oxide. Here I'm starting to go a little bit of a darker green, so I've added phthalo blue into my paint along with some of that pyrrole red light just to make it duller. And I'm looking for places for this darker green in the shadows in between the trees and underneath some of the foliage that I see. At this end stage of the painting, I'm looking for titches to do, so I'm adding some titches of yellow highlights in some places, and this is actually a tinted cadmium yellow, and there's little bits of glazes of that transparent red oxide to show more shadow areas. And a little bit in the foreground, trying to create a balance between the grasses and the darker areas up top. At this stage of the painting, I'm trying to be careful not to overwork and do too much. So I do a lot more looking than actually putting down the paint. So I'm taking my time here and seeing where I need to go lighter and or darker. As I've worked through this painting, one of the things I've been aware of is the coolness and the warmness of the color I'm placing. That was another goal, was to make sure that I have warm and cool juxtaposition as well as dull and bright. And continuing to cool on top of some of the warms in these grasses, scratching in to let some of the underneath color show through. And that creates a really interesting change of color throughout the painting. It still looked like I needed a little bit more shadow in the foreground to balance out the midtones of the background trees, so I'm adding a little bit more transparent red oxide in a few places. It also creates a sense of shadow between some of the masses of the grass. And here I'm adding a little bit more dark green onto the top left tree to give it a feeling that there's a shadow being cast onto it. It also helps to bring that tree forward and look a little different than the other trees that we have on the right hand side. Here I'm adding a little bit more dark. Realized I went a bit too dark, so just wiping a bit off. I really don't want that paint to get too dense because the goal is to let those colors show through. Okay, I think I'll stop now and meet my goal of not overworking a painting. So here it is. Thanks so much for watching, and following is a supply list. And you can subscribe by hitting the subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.